Robert Bales. In March 2012, Staff Sergeant Robert Bales left his base in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, and carried out one of the deadliest atrocities of the war. Moving through 2 villages in the Panjwai district, he shot and killed 16 civilians, including women and children, some of whom were later found burned in their homes. Survivors described scenes of terror as Bales moved deliberately from house to house, leaving families devastated in his wake. Bales had enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2001 and completed 4 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Fellow soldiers noted both his experience and his struggles: financial pressures, drinking, and growing signs of strain from years in combat. But none of these explained the calculated brutality of that night. After the killings, Afghan villagers carried the bodies to nearby bases, demanding accountability. The massacre sparked outrage across Afghanistan and the world, leading to protests and condemnation of the U.S. military presence. Bales was taken into custody by American military police, flown out of Afghanistan, and held at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, while awaiting trial. On June 5, 2013, in a military courtroom at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, Robert Bales pleaded guilty to 16 counts of premeditated murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, and additional assault charges. His guilty plea allowed him to avoid the death penalty, but in his statement to the court, he admitted that there is not a good reason in this world for why he did the terrible things he did. In August 2013, a military jury sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. John M. Russell. In May 2009, inside the U.S. Army's Camp Liberty base in Baghdad, Iraq, Staff Sergeant John Russell carried out one of the deadliest acts of fratricide in the Iraq War. Russell, a communications specialist with the 54th Engineer Battalion, had been showing signs of emotional distress and was sent to the base's combat stress clinic. Earlier that day, his commanders had confiscated his weapon after he became agitated, but he managed to seize his escort's rifle during the visit. Russell entered the clinic and opened fire on unarmed personnel, killing 5 U.S. service members. He shot Army psychiatrist Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Housel, Specialist Jacob Barton, Specialist Michael Yates, Navy Commander Charles Springle, and Hospitalman 3rd Class Dustin Burnett. According to testimony, the shooting ended only after Russell emptied the weapon and fled the scene. He was quickly subdued and placed under arrest. Military prosecutors charged Russell with 5 counts of premeditated murder. The defense argued that years of deployments and depression led to a mental breakdown, while prosecutors insisted that his actions taking a rifle, loading it, and deliberately targeting medical staff were calculated and intentional. After years of legal proceedings, the case reached a verdict in 2013 at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington. A military judge found Russell guilty of premeditated murder and rejected the claim that his mental illness excused his actions. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Raul Hernandez Perez. At Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, Specialist Raul Hernandez Perez carried out an act of shocking brutality against his wife, 25-year-old Selena Hernandez. According to court testimony reported by Stars and Stripes, Hernandez Perez admitted that in November 2020 he struck his wife with a baseball bat and then stabbed her multiple times, killing her inside their base housing unit. Her body was later discovered in a trash can on the installation, as confirmed by Hawaii News Now. Prosecutors revealed, in coverage by Military Times, that Hernandez Perez had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on his wife in the months leading up to the killing, suggesting a calculated motive. Court records also showed that Hernandez Perez violated a no-contact order issued by his chain of command, an offense he also pleaded guilty to under Article 91 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Initially, as Army Times reported in June 2021, Hernandez Perez entered a not guilty plea to the charges of murder and disobeying orders. But on September 14, 2021, as reported by both the Associated Press and Civil Beat, he changed his plea to guilty on both counts, surprising the courtroom on the morning the trial was set to begin. His guilty plea was part of an agreement that capped his punishment between 50 and 65 years in confinement. At a general court-martial held at Wheeler Army Airfield, a military judge sentenced Hernandez Perez to 62 years in prison. He was also reduced to the lowest enlisted grade, dishonorably discharged and permanently removed from the Army. Michael Behenna. Under the orders of the U.S. Army, First Lieutenant Michael Behenna of the 101st Airborne Division was tasked with returning an Iraqi detainee, Ali Mansour Mohammed, to his village on May 16, 2008. Mansour had been held for suspected involvement in insurgent activity and a roadside bombing that had killed 2 of Behenna's soldiers, but he was released due to insufficient evidence. Instead of delivering Mansour safely home, Behenna diverted the convoy. He took Mansour under a bridge in the Iraqi desert, stripped him naked, and began interrogating him at gunpoint. Behenna later claimed that Mansour tried to grab his weapon, but forensic experts testified that the physical evidence showed otherwise. In that encounter, Behenna fired 2 shots, one striking Mansour in the chest and the other in the head, killing him instantly. On July 31, 2008, Behenna was arrested and charged with unpremeditated murder and assault. His court-martial took place in early 2009 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. In March 2009, a military panel convicted him and sentenced him to 25 years in prison, but the sentence was later reduced to 15 years on appeal, and he was incarcerated in the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. After serving nearly 5 years, he was paroled in 2014. Then, on May 6, 2019, President Donald Trump issued him a full pardon, restoring his freedom and erasing the conviction. Clint Lorance. In July 2012, First Lieutenant Clint Lorance, a U.S. Army platoon leader, ordered his soldiers to open fire on 3 Afghan men riding a motorcycle near their patrol in Kandahar province. 2 of the men were killed and a 3rd escaped. Army investigators later determined that no weapons were found on the bodies, and several of Lorance's own soldiers testified that the riders did not pose an immediate threat at the time of the shooting. In the weeks that followed, the Army charged Lorance with multiple crimes. At his general court-martial at Fort Bragg in 2013, he was convicted of 2 counts of unpremeditated murder, as well as attempted murder, obstruction of justice, wrongfully communicating a threat, and solicitation. The military jury sentenced him to 20 years in prison, ordered his dismissal from the service, and stripped him of his rank. Lorance's case became the subject of intense national debate. Supporters argued that he had been punished for making a split-second decision in a dangerous combat zone, while critics emphasized that his actions had unlawfully taken civilian lives, a fact reinforced by testimony from his own men. After his appeals were denied, Lorance continued serving his sentence at the U.S. disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. However, on November 15, 2019, President Donald Trump issued him a full pardon. The clemency order immediately released him from prison after 6 years of confinement. Joseph A. Santiago. On September 27, 2021, pregnant Megan Santiago sustained blunt force trauma at her Fort Campbell home and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors performed an emergency C-section, delivering her baby prematurely, but Megan did not survive her injuries. Prosecutors told the jury that Megan had documented the abuse she suffered at the hands of her husband, Sergeant First Class Joseph Santiago, through texts and pictures. In one message she wrote, "I'm really lost. I think he's going to kill me one of these days." Prosecutors also said Santiago had searched online how hard someone must be hit to render them unconscious, and they pointed to at least 8 prior incidents of domestic violence. The defense argued Megan had been drinking while pregnant and at times hid her pregnancy from Santiago, and they claimed some injuries could have been the result of falls. On August 2, 2023, a panel of officers found Sergeant First Class Joseph Santiago guilty of 1 specification of murder and 1 specification of injury to an unborn child. He was acquitted of 2 specifications of domestic violence. The panel sentenced him to a dishonorable discharge, reduction in rank to private, and confinement for life with eligibility for parole. Calvin Gibbs. Staff Sergeant Calvin Gibbs was a U.S. Army squad leader from Billings, Montana, deployed to Afghanistan in 2009 with the 5th Stryker Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division. Between January and May 2010, he led a conspiracy that became known as the Kill Team. a group of soldiers who murdered unarmed Afghan civilians and staged the killings to look like combat engagements. The first killing took place in January 2010 in Kandahar province. Gul Muddin, a 15-year-old farmer, was shot after Gibbs and others threw a grenade and opened fire. Gibbs planted an AK-47 near the boy's body to make him appear to be an enemy combatant. In May 2010, Gibbs and another soldier murdered Mullah Adadad by throwing grenades at him and then firing rifles. Later that same month, the unit killed a third villager, Marachachach, during a staged ambush. Fellow soldiers testified that Gibbs collected human body parts as trophies. He kept fingers, teeth, and even leg bones, and he boasted to others about what he had done. Prosecutors showed that he encouraged his men to view killings as sport and that he pressured younger soldiers to take part. Army investigators uncovered the crimes after soldiers came forward. Gibbs was arrested in 2010 and charged with 3 counts of premeditated murder, along with conspiracy, assault, and obstruction of justice. During the court-martial at Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington, witnesses, including Private Jeremy Morlock, testified against him, describing how Gibbs directed the killings and orchestrated the cover-ups. On November 10, 2011, a military jury found Calvin Gibbs guilty of 3 murders and multiple other charges. The next day, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Gibbs' conviction made him the highest-ranking soldier held responsible in the Maiwand district murders. Nidal Malik Hasan. On November 5, 2009, Major Nidal Malik Hasan, a U.S. Army psychiatrist, carried out a mass shooting at the Soldier Readiness Processing Center on Fort Hood in Texas. Armed with a semi-automatic pistol, he shouted "Allahu Akbar" before opening fire on soldiers and civilians preparing for deployment. In the attack, Hasan killed 13 people, including 12 soldiers and 1 civilian, and wounded more than 30 others. He was stopped when civilian police officers on the base, including Sergeant Mark Todd and Sergeant Kimberly Munley, returned fire. He was shot, paralyzed from the chest down, and arrested at the scene. In July 2011, a military Article 32 hearing confirmed the charges: 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Hasan represented himself at trial, openly admitting that he was responsible and claiming that he acted to protect Taliban fighters overseas. On August 23, 2013, a panel of military officers convicted him on all charges, and 5 days later, on August 28, 2013, the same panel sentenced him to death. Hasan is currently confined to military death row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, awaiting appellate review. Isaac Aguigui. Private Isaac Aguigui was convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Sergeant Deirdre Wetzker Aguigui, at Fort Stewart, Georgia in July 2011. A military doctor determined that Deirdre's cause of death was strangulation, and her death was ruled a homicide. Investigators revealed that Isaac told others his wife's death was a dry run for killing someone, and he later admitted that he received more than $500,000 in life insurance benefits from her death. He used that money to finance a militia he named Forever Enduring, Always Ready, known by the acronym FEAR. The group's purpose was not just military camaraderie. Evidence in court showed it was a domestic terror organization led by Isaac that plotted assassinations, bombings, and violent attacks inside the United States. Members of FEAR stockpiled weapons and trained in the woods, preparing for what they called missions. During his bench trial in Liberty County, Georgia, prosecutors presented text messages, witness testimony, and financial records tracing the insurance money directly to the formation of FEAR. They described Isaac as manipulative and ruthless, exploiting the death of his wife and unborn child to bankroll extremist violence. On March 27, 2014, Judge Robert Russell found Isaac Aguigui guilty of malice murder and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jeremy Morlock. In 2010, Specialist Jeremy Morlock, a U.S. Army soldier from Wasilla, Alaska, was deployed to Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, with the 5th Stryker Brigade based out of Joint Base Lewis McChord. While serving there, Morlock became part of the group of soldiers who came to be known worldwide as the Kill Team, the unit that carried out premeditated murders of unarmed Afghan civilians and staged them to look like combat engagements. Victims were chosen at random, killed with grenades and gunfire, and then manipulated with planted weapons so the deaths could be falsely reported as legitimate battlefield encounters. One of the victims was Gul Muddin, a 15-year-old boy killed in January 2010 after being lured from his home and executed. Another man was killed in February 2010 in a staged attack, and a third victim was murdered in May 2010 while working in his fields. Morlock later admitted that he and other soldiers posed for photographs with the corpses, treating the killings as trophies. These images later surfaced publicly, causing worldwide outrage and drawing scrutiny to the Army's internal discipline and oversight. Morlock was arrested in 2010 and became one of the first soldiers prosecuted in the case. Initially, he tried to shift blame, but he later gave detailed testimony about the murders and the role of Staff Sergeant Calvin Gibbs, who was identified as the ringleader and accused of encouraging the killings and the collection of body parts as war souvenirs. Morlock's testimony became central evidence in the military's effort to convict the others. On March 23, 2011, at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, Morlock pleaded guilty before a military judge to 3 counts of premeditated murder, conspiracy, and other related charges. In exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors, he was spared the death penalty, but sentenced to 24 years in prison. Brent Burke. In September 2007, tragedy struck Rhineyville, Kentucky, when Tracy Burke and her mother, Karen Comer, were found murdered inside their home. Tracy was the estranged wife of Sergeant Brent Burke, an Army Ranger stationed at Fort Campbell. Their marriage had been turbulent, marred by allegations of domestic abuse and repeated threats. On the night of September 11, 2007, both women were shot execution-style, and investigators quickly suspected Burke due to the ongoing disputes and history of violence within the family. Civilian prosecutors brought Burke to trial 4 times in Hardin County, Kentucky, but each ended without a conviction. Jurors deadlocked and mistrials were declared, leaving the families of the victims without closure and the accused soldier still serving in uniform. 4 years later, in 2011, the Army stepped in, transferring the case into military jurisdiction at Fort Campbell. A court-martial convened under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Prosecutors presented testimony about Burke's history of threats, his violent temper, and witness accounts linking him to the murders. They also called upon his children, who testified that they saw him commit the crime, and this time, the outcome was different. On May 8, 2012, a military panel found Sergeant Brent Burke guilty on all charges, including the premeditated murders of Tracy Burke and Karen Comer. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Anthony Peden. On December 5, 2011, Sergeant Anthony Peden joined other members of a clandestine militia group known as FEAR, Forever Enduring, Always Ready, in carrying out a double murder near Fort Stewart, Georgia. The victims were 19-year-old Michael Rourke, a former Army private who had recently left the service, and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Tiffany York. Investigators later determined that both were executed because Rourke knew too much about the group's activities and its violent plans. FEAR was more than a loose band of soldiers. It was a well-armed anti-government militia made up largely of active-duty troops. The group stockpiled military-grade weapons, plotted to bomb infrastructure, and even discussed assassinating government leaders. Prosecutors revealed that Peden, who had served multiple combat tours, fell under the influence of Isaac Aguigui, the ringleader who envisioned large-scale domestic terrorism. On that night in Long County, Peden and his fellow soldiers lured Rourke and York to a desolate wooded area. The couple was shot multiple times at close range in what prosecutors described as execution-style killings. The murders were meant to silence Rourke permanently, ensuring that the militia's existence and ambitions would not be exposed. The killings shattered the secrecy of FEAR, and in the years that followed, authorities dismantled the militia and its members were prosecuted in a series of trials. In 2014, Anthony Peden stood before a Georgia judge and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of malice murder. His plea avoided a possible death sentence, but it ended his freedom permanently, as the court sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Jeremiah Hill. On the night of October 5, 2013, Specialist Tevin Geikie, a 20-year-old soldier stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord, was walking with two friends along Pacific Highway South in Lakewood, Washington, when a car carrying other soldiers drove past. Words were exchanged and tensions escalated. According to Pierce County prosecutors, Private Jeremiah Hill, then 23 years old, got out of the vehicle, confronted Geikie, and stabbed him with a knife, leaving him bleeding on the roadside. His friends attempted to save him, but Geikie died from the wound before medics could arrive. Police quickly tracked the suspects with help from witnesses. 3 days after the crime, on October 8th, Pierce County authorities announced that Jeremiah Hill had been charged with first-degree murder, while two other soldiers, Sidarium Johnson and Ajani Runyon Berford, faced charges of rendering criminal assistance for helping Hill after the stabbing. On April 22, 2015, a jury in Pierce County Superior Court found Hill guilty of murder in the second degree, meaning murder without premeditation but with intent. Judge Edmund Murphy sentenced him to 45 years in prison. Evan Vela. On May 11, 2006, in a rural area southwest of Baghdad, a U.S. sniper team was hiding in a concealed position near the village of Jarf Sakhr when an unarmed Iraqi man, Ghani Nasser Janabi, walked into their hideout. According to testimony, Staff Sergeant Michael A. Hensley told Sergeant Evan Vela to take out his 9mm pistol and shoot the civilian. Vela, who was exhausted after days without proper rest, followed the order and fired a single shot that killed Janabi. After the killing, prosecutors said members of the sniper team planted an AK-47 on Janabi's body in order to make the death look justified. Vela was accused not only of pulling the trigger, but also of lying in his official statement and helping stage the scene by placing the weapon. During the trial, Vela's lawyers argued that he had been placed under unbearable stress and that he acted only because a superior had ordered him to do so. Hensley denied giving the order, though he admitted that a weapon was placed on the body afterward. On February 11, 2008, a military jury found Sergeant Evan Vela guilty of unpremeditated murder, of making a false official statement, and of aiding in the planting of the rifle on Janabi's corpse. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, stripped of all pay and benefits, and dishonorably discharged from the Army. John E. Hatley. In 2007, during a deployment to Baghdad, First Sergeant John E. Hatley and soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment took 4 Iraqi men into custody. The detainees were blindfolded, handcuffed, and driven to a canal instead of being transferred to a detention center. Right there, Hatley ordered that the prisoners be executed, and several soldiers fired their weapons, leaving the bodies in the water. The killings were concealed, but in time members of the unit reported what had happened. Investigators determined that the act was not a combat engagement but a deliberate execution of unarmed detainees. Hatley was arrested and brought before a court-martial at Rose Barracks in Vilseck, Germany, and witnesses testified that he directed the shootings and instructed others to keep silent. On April 16, 2009, a military jury found First Sergeant John E. Hatley guilty of premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, reduced in rank, and dishonorably discharged. He was confined to the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. After serving over 11 years, Hatley was granted parole in 2020. Army Times reported that he was released in October of that year, and local coverage confirmed that he returned to Central Texas, where he married on the day of his release. Hasan Karim Akbar. On the night of March 23, 2003, at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait, Sergeant Hasan Karim Akbar of the 326th Engineer Battalion carried out a deadly insider attack against his own unit as they prepared for the invasion of Iraq. Armed with stolen grenades and a rifle, Akbar crept into the camp while his fellow soldiers slept. He first disabled the power generator, plunging the tents into darkness, then pulled the pins on fragmentation grenades and hurled them into the tents where officers were resting. Explosions ripped through the compound, and in the confusion, Akbar opened fire on soldiers who rushed to help the wounded. The attack killed Army Captain Christopher Scott Seifert, a 27-year-old from Pennsylvania, and Air Force Major Gregory Stone, a 40-year-old from Idaho. 14 other service members were wounded, several critically. Survivors described chaos, smoke, and terror as they realized the assault was not coming from the enemy, but from within their own ranks. Akbar was quickly overpowered and arrested by fellow soldiers at the scene. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered Akbar's personal journals, where he wrote about deep resentment toward the army, fear that U.S. troops would kill Muslims, and intentions to strike against his own comrades. These writings were used at trial to demonstrate premeditation. The defense argued that he suffered from mental illness, but a military jury rejected those claims after hearing the evidence. On April 21, 2005, a panel of 15 military jurors convicted Akbar of 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted premeditated murder. A week later, the same jury sentenced him to death, making him the first American soldier since the Vietnam era to receive the death penalty for killing fellow U.S. troops during wartime. He was sent to the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he remains on military death row. Justin E. Cope. Staff Sergeant Justin E. Cope, assigned to the 1st Armored Division at Fort Bliss, pleaded guilty on May 30, 2024 to 1 specification of murder and 2 specifications of assault consummated by battery. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison, reduced in rank to private, and dishonorably discharged. Court documents show that in February 2019, a child under the age of 16 died in El Paso after suffering non-accidental abusive head trauma. Army investigators concluded that the injuries were inflicted with hands and not the result of an accident. The Army initially charged Cope with 2 murder specifications for the same death, one alleging that he intended to kill or do great bodily harm, and the other alleging that he knew death was a probable consequence of his actions. In addition, Cope faced charges stemming from a 2017 incident in Wiesau, Germany. The Army Times reported that prosecutors accused him of squeezing the face of a juvenile girl and shaking her body, which caused head trauma. On May 30, 2024, at Fort Bliss, Cope entered his guilty plea before a military judge and the sentence was imposed immediately: 17 years confinement, reduction in rank, and a dishonorable discharge. Cory Clagett. Under the scorching heat of the Iraqi desert on May 9, 2006, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division carried out what was known as Operation Iron Triangle, a mission near the Muthanna chemical complex north of Baghdad. The goal was to capture insurgents believed to be operating from the area, but instead, 4 Iraqi men were detained, alongside women and a baby who were released unharmed. What happened next turned the operation into one of the most infamous war crime cases of the Iraq War. Private First Class Cory R. Clagett, just 22 years old, stood with Specialist William Hunsaker and Specialist Justin Graber under the command of Corporal Raymond Girard. According to testimony, Girard told his men that military-age males were to be killed. The detainees were handcuffed, but the cuffs were cut, and the unarmed prisoners were ordered to run. As they fled, Clagett admitted that he opened fire on 2 men, while Hunsaker fired at a third. Graber would later testify that he delivered what he called a mercy killing to a wounded detainee. Clagett later confessed in court that he had indeed shot the detainees and admitted there was no legal justification for his actions. His own words in the military courtroom were chillingly direct. When asked why, he responded, "To kill them, Your Honor." On January 25, 2007, a military judge at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, sentenced Cory Clagett to 18 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to premeditated murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was reduced in rank to private, forfeited all pay and benefits, and received a dishonorable discharge. William Hunsaker got the same 18-year sentence, while Graber was sentenced to 9 months after a reduced plea. Staff Sergeant Girard was later convicted of negligent homicide and related offenses. Neftali Platero. In September 2010, at a U.S. base in Fallujah, Iraq, Specialist Neftali Platero opened fire inside his living quarters, shooting 3 of his fellow soldiers. Specialist John Carrillo, Jr. of Stockton, California, and Private First Class Gabra Noonan of Watertown, Connecticut, were killed. A third roommate was wounded but survived the attack. The violence followed an argument that began over the state of the room, which other soldiers described as messy. Prosecutors argued that Platero armed himself and carried out the shootings deliberately. Witnesses testified that the incident was not an accident, but a calculated act inside the barracks. Platero was arrested by military authorities and charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder, 1 count of attempted premeditated murder, and assault. His court-martial took place at Fort Stewart, Georgia, in 2012, where the panel convicted him of the charges. On June 13, 2012, Specialist Neftali Platero was found guilty of murdering Carrillo and Noonan, and of attempting to kill the surviving roommate. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Andrew Holmes. In January 2010, Private First Class Andrew Holmes was deployed to Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, with the Army's 5th Stryker Brigade. At just 19 years old, Holmes became one of the kill team murderers. During a patrol in the village of La Mohammed Kalai, Holmes admitted that he fired a machine gun at a 15-year-old unarmed Afghan civilian after another soldier, Specialist Jeremy Morlock, threw a grenade to stage an attack. Andrew Holmes was accused of possessing a finger bone from a corpse and of smoking hashish while deployed. On September 23, 2011, he pleaded guilty before a military judge at Joint Base Lewis McChord to unpremeditated murder and related charges, and the next day he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The judge acknowledged his young age and claims that he was influenced by older, higher-ranking soldiers, but the conviction made clear his responsibility in pulling the trigger that killed an unarmed teenager. David Lawrence. In October 2010, U.S. Army Specialist David Lawrence was stationed in Kandahar Province with the 1st Infantry Division. On the night of October 17th, he was assigned to guard an Afghan detainee, Mullah Mahibullah, a Taliban commander who had recently been captured in Arghandab. During his shift, Lawrence unlocked the cell, entered, and shot Mahibullah in the head at close range, killing him instantly. Lawrence had been struggling with severe mental health issues before the incident. Reports showed that he had been treated for depression, paranoia, and possible schizophrenia, and 2 Army doctors later concluded that he might not have understood the wrongfulness of his actions. Despite these findings, the Army moved forward with prosecution, emphasizing that he had knowingly carried out the killing. In November 2010, Lawrence was formally charged with premeditated murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. At his general court-martial held at Fort Carson, Colorado, on May 25, 2011, he pleaded guilty to the charge, and the military judge sentenced him to 12.5 years in prison, reduction to the rank of private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge. Joseph C. Bozicevich. In September 2008, at Patrol Base Jerf at Saakri, south of Baghdad, a confrontation inside an American outpost turned fatal. Sergeant Joseph Bozicevich, a soldier with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 4th Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, drew his weapon and opened fire on 2 of his own squad mates. The victims were 24-year-old Staff Sergeant Darius Dawson of Pensacola, Florida, and 26-year-old Sergeant Wesley Durbin of Hurst, Texas. Both men were struck multiple times and killed instantly. Witnesses later told investigators that Bozicevich shouted, "I'm going to kill you," before firing. Afterward, he was immediately apprehended by fellow soldiers. According to testimony preserved in court records, he admitted without remorse, saying, "I did it, so what?" On October 2, 2008, the Army preferred charges of premeditated murder against him. The convening authority referred the case to a general court-martial in July 2009, and Bozicevich stood trial at Fort Stewart, Georgia. On May 25, 2011, a military jury found Bozicevich guilty of 2 specifications of premeditated murder. Later, on August 10, 2011, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In addition to the life sentence, the court ordered his rank reduced from sergeant to private, all pay and allowances forfeited, and a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. Christopher Salmon. Private First Class Christopher Salmon was among the group known as Fear Forever Enduring Always Ready, who murdered a former soldier at Fort Stewart, Michael Rourke, and his 17-year-old girlfriend Tiffany York in the woods in Long County, Georgia. Michael was targeted because they believed he was a threat to the secrecy of their militia, and Tiffany York was killed simply because she was with him that night. Christopher Salmon was arrested and charged with the double murder, and in April 2014 he pleaded guilty to malice murder in a Long County courtroom. As part of his plea, he admitted his role in the killings and accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Naimm Williams. In July 2005, 5-year-old Talia Williams was living on Wheeler Army Airfield in Hawaii with her father, Army Specialist Naimm Williams, and his wife Delilah. Prosecutors later revealed that the child had been the victim of severe and ongoing abuse. Both Naimm and Delilah admitted that they regularly beat the child, leaving her body covered in injuries. On July 16, 2005, the violence turned fatal when Naimm Williams struck his daughter in the chest with such force that she collapsed and never regained consciousness. Because the crime took place on military property, the federal government took jurisdiction. In August 2005, a federal grand jury indicted Naimm Williams for first-degree felony murder under U.S. law, alleging a pattern and practice of assault and torture against a child that resulted in death. His wife, Delilah Williams, pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder and cooperated with prosecutors, testifying about the beatings and abuse that had become routine inside their home. The trial began in Honolulu Federal Court in 2014 and became the first death penalty case prosecuted in Hawaii since it became a state. Jurors heard graphic testimony about the months of abuse, saw autopsy photographs, and were told how the child had been starved, duct-taped, and beaten repeatedly. In April 2014, the jury convicted Naimm Williams of felony murder, as well as child abuse, assault, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to investigators. Federal prosecutors sought the death penalty, but after weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury could not unanimously agree on execution. Because federal law requires unanimity, the deadlock spared Williams from death, and on July 14, 2014, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of release. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.